Well, welcome all, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. And Saab is very pleased to be part of the ASPI team, and we look forward to a long relationship. We're also very pleased to host this particular event. It's something that we actually target because it's well attended by industry, and it's probably, it's always very informative, and we really appreciate what Mark has to say. Mark's been doing this for 16 years, 16 consecutive years, as I found out today. So that's not a bad track record. And years are something that we're counting. For Saab this year, this is our 30th year in Australia. So we think that's pretty impressive from our perspective. We want to be around for another 30 years or more. But I think one of the reasons why we're particularly interested in what Mark has to say is that the decisions that the government makes on acquisition and procurement over the next 2 years will really affect the future of Saab in Australia. But I think it will also fundamentally affect the way defence industry will look in Australia over the next 30 years. The budget that Mark's going to explain for us tonight, will provide some insight into that. A couple of years ago, I described Mark as the man that needs no introduction because everyone knows him. So, ladies and gentlemen, the man that needs no introduction.
Thanks very much, Jared. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by giving credit where credit's due. My name's on the front of the budget brief, but it takes a lot of work by a lot of people at ASPI to pull together the launch. And I want to thank them here. It couldn't happen without all of the support I get. In my talk this evening, I'm going to divide it into 3 parts. I'll begin by giving you the key facts and figures from this year's defence budget. Of the 292 charts, tables and graphics that I somehow squeezed into it this year, I've selected, because I realise I'm halfway between you and dinner, I've selected a single graph to show you. To do anything else I think would be cruel and unusual. Then I want to examine several issues that I think will be critical to the delivery of the future ADF envisaged by last year's Defence White Paper. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the most basic question in defence planning: how much is enough? Let's start by following the money. Here's a chart showing past and planned defence spending. The vertical grey bars are baseline spending in the department. The red caps represent the supplementation that the department gets for the additional cost of operations. And the black dotted line is the threshold of 2% of GDP. It changes over time as the economy waxes and wanes. As a result of this year's budget, defence spending in 2017-18 will be $34.7 billion. That'll represent 1.9% of GDP, and it's a 6.5% real increase on last year's defence budget. The largest measure in this year's budget was an additional $936 million over 4 years to cover the cost of operations around the world. That includes operations both in Afghanistan, where next year we're going to spend, I've muffed it, let me start again. Next year, the cost of operations will amount to $903 million, including $454 million for fighting Islamic State and $222 million for operations in support in the Middle East area. At present, there are around 2,300 women and men of the ADF deployed on various operations. Defence was also subject to efficiency dividends in this budget and in the mid-year adjustments that were made prior to the budget. They amount to about $500 million over 4 years. Now, while that might seem to be a case of the government stepping away from its white paper funding commitment, the efficiencies relate to areas where there's been precipitous growth in expenditure over the last couple of years. These include spending on consultants, contractors and business travel. Taken in context, the efficiency measures are neither onerous nor unreasonable. This year's measures and dividends were but small shifts to the $30 billion wedge of additional funding granted by last year's white paper. Largely because of that wedge, the hallowed benchmark of 2% of GDP is projected to be met in 2020-21 as forecast in last year's white paper. That's 3 years ahead of what was promised back in 2013. But don't get too excited by that. The early projected attainment was largely driven by falling forecasts of GDP growth. The next few years will see spending increase by an average of 4.7% per annum in real terms, with investment in new equipment the main beneficiary. In 2015-16, that's the year prior to the white paper, capital investment in both equipment and facilities and other areas stood at $9.2 billion. By 2020-21, it will reach $16 billion, and by 2025-26, it will exceed $23 billion. In that same year, 9 years from today, the total defence budget will be close to $59 billion in nominal terms, or in this year's dollars, about $48.5 billion. To put that in context, it means that between 2005 and 2025, that 20-year period, the defence budget will have doubled in real terms. Of course, spending money is only a means. It's not an end in itself. The goal behind the planned substantial diversion of national wealth is set out in last year's white paper. And it's a very simple goal. The ADF is going to grow moderately, and it's going to become much better equipped in a whole range of areas. Key elements of the future force that's being built include 72 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. They'll replace our ageing F-18 Hornets. There'll be 9 anti-submarine warfare configured frigates. They will replace the existing smaller 8 Anzac frigates. And finally, there'll be 12 regionally superior conventional submarines, which will replace our existing 6 Collins-class boats. These are just the headline items. Almost every aspect of ADF capability is either slanted for enhancement or modest expansion over the next 20 years. So where are we at today? In the 14 months since the release of the 2016 Defence White Paper, the government continues to fulfil its funding promise. Defence continues to initiate new acquisition projects, and industry have gotten on with the job of delivering the equipment and support that the ADF needs to grow stronger. It's early days yet, but for the moment at least, things are largely on track. There are 2 risks to defence funding going forward. On the supply side, current and future governments are likely to find it hard to placate a fractious electorate that shows little interest in national security. With an election in 2019 and a planned return to surplus the year after, the test will come soon enough. As we saw between 2009 and 2013, it's possible for an Australian government to prioritise returning to surplus above building a stronger defence force. On the demand side, the risk is that the planned growth in capital investment will outstrip the capacity of defence and of defence industry to deliver. As the current raft of large off-the-shelf foreign purchases subsides, it will give way to an even larger series of projects of domestic naval construction. As that happens, the risk of underspending will grow. Back in the 2000s, anything more than a 5% per annum increase in equipment purchases proved unsustainable. Current plans look at increasing equipment purchases by about 7.8% per annum between now and 2025. Then, as now, the harsh rule is this: use it or lose it. Nothing will encourage an Australian government to withdraw defence funding more than money being handed back. But these are challenges for the future. What I want to do now is to turn to look at three areas that are critical to the delivery of the future ADF described in the 2016 Defence White Paper. Those areas are personnel, defence industry, and procurement. Let's start with personnel. Adequate numbers of properly trained personnel, both civilian and military, are essential to the delivery of ADF capability. So it's good news that after struggling to maintain its numbers for a few years, the ADF workforce looks to be in much better shape. For the most recent year reported, the ADF met 90% of its recruiting targets, compared with a historical average of only 86%. And the separation rate from the permanent force was 8.3%, compared with a historical average of 10.8%. These are marked and encouraging improvements in both areas. Nonetheless, the current ADF has 333 fewer people than was budgeted for, although that's only a small part of the current workforce of 59,000 permanent members. And it's certainly a much better result than the shortfalls of between 1,000 and 2,000 people that were experienced between 2012 and 2015. If only things were looking that good for Defence's civilian workforce. This year, civilian numbers fell 600 positions below what was budgeted for, and that's from a workforce about a third the size of the ADF, or less than a third the size of the ADF. And recent internal surveys have revealed disappointingly low morale among the civilian workforce. In a survey from March 2016, 41% of civilians rated their workplace morale as either low or very low, while only 17% of their ADF colleagues were similarly disaffected. Not having had a pay rise since 2013 and being offered an increase below that awarded to ADF members, and in doing so breaking a quarter century of precedent, it's not surprising that morale is low among the civilian workforce. But with the government now predicting economy-wide wage growth of between 2.5% and 3% over the next couple of years, now is the time to stop treating civilians as second-class members of the defence workforce and to restore parity with military wage increases. I'd like to turn now to talk about defence industry. Defence industry was elevated to the status of a fundamental input to capability in the 2016 Defence Industry Policy Statement. For those of you who aren't familiar with the nomenclature, within defence, to ensure that all of the components that are necessary to deliver capability are available, they have a list of fundamental inputs. They include things like personnel, doctrine, training, equipment, so on and so forth. Well, defence industry has been added to that list. With no risk of exaggeration, I can say that it's been an exciting 12 months for Australian defence industry. While many previous defence industry policies have gathered dust, the 2016 policy statement has led to a flurry of action. We now have a dedicated Minister for Defence Industry, and despite the misgivings of many commentators, it appears to be working well to have two ministers at the top of the defence organisation. And the three key components of the government's decade-long $1.6 billion defence industry program are now up and running. They include the Centre for Defence Industry Capability, the Defence Innovation Hub, and the Next Generation Technologies Fund. And the first awarded contracts under the Next Generation Technology Fund occurred only a couple of months ago. More importantly, and in a departure from its 2016 Defence Policy Statement, the government has adopted an avowed Buy Australian policy. To quote the Prime Minister, "I am determined that every dollar we spend on defence procurement, as far as possible, should be spent in Australia. We haven't seen such an overt commitment to local content since the old Australian Industry Involvement Program of the 1990s. But back then we had Australian industry content targets for each project. Now the overriding philosophy is as much Australian content as possible is what's to be sought. Whether it's the lucrative $195 billion of projects that's now up for grabs over the next decade in the Integrated Investment Plan, or the Buy Australian policy that's just been rolled out, international defence firms have spent the past 12 months redoubling their investments in Australia. New offices and research centres have been popping up in South Australia and elsewhere. New global supply chain agreements have been signed and existing agreements have been renewed. The good government could not have asked for a more encouraging response from industry. At the same time, and as Gerard mentioned earlier, I think that one of the motivations is that people know that there's a lot at stake. The next couple of years will indeed see decisions made that will shape defence industry for decades hence. There will be winners and there will be losers. Industry knows that, and they know that they only have one chance to stake their claim. Progress continues on the centrepiece of the government's vision for Australian defence industry. That is, continuous naval construction split between South Australia and Western Australia, with the major war vessels and submarines in South Australia and the minor war vessels in Western Australia. Although construction won't start till 2018 for the offshore patrol vessels, 2020 for the frigates, and either 2022 or 2023 for the submarines, initial work is now well underway. Requests for tender have been released for both the future frigates and the offshore patrol vessels, and a design and mobilisation contract has been signed with our submarine design partner, DCNS from France. By mid-2018, to give you some idea of the pace of activity that's already underway, more than $446 million would have been spent on submarines, and more than $290 million would have been spent on the frigates. The government's long-awaited naval shipbuilding plan was released in mid-May, and while there are still many unknowns, which will only be resolved by decisions that are yet to be made, the plan provides much useful information. For one, we now know that the government will own the naval shipbuilding infrastructure in both South Australia and Western Australia, and they have plans to invest substantially, about $500 million in South Australia and about $100 million in Western Australia, in both those locations. There was also further information on schedules, though some of the numbers did not quite ring true, and there seemed to be a hint that the future frigate program might be delayed. That might not be a terrible thing. Though the fiendish politics of shipbuilding would make it politically damaging for a delay to occur, the potential cost of hastening too quickly with a $35 billion project could in the long run be much more costly. On the critical question of contractual arrangements, we remain in the dark. This is a challenge that this or a future government will have to surmount. What's being created, in effect, are monopoly shipyards, two of them at least, one in South Australia, one in Western Australia, and to some extent the submarines fall into the same category. The question is how productivity and efficiency and value for money are going to be delivered from these monopoly programs. Coming back to the government's emphasis on local defence purchasing, there's been surprisingly little economic analysis to back up the idea that Australian defence industry will be the backbone of the government's broader jobs and growth push. I've only found 2 studies released by Defence addressing the question. A 2016 study projecting the impact of Joint Strike Fighter-related exports, and a 2015 study looking at a hypothetical 6-boat submarine program. It's like half a future frigate program. Now, I don't pretend to understand the economic models used. They are black boxes in the truest sense of the word. But the results are clear enough. The F-35 model forecasts an average of around 4,000 net additional jobs over 33 years based on annual expenditure of annual exports rather, of $161 million. The submarine modelling forecasts an average of only 733 net additional jobs over 16 years based on average annual expenditure of over $900 million. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the submarine program, you'll say 733, that's not right. There's something like 2,800 people involved in the submarine program, and indeed there is. What the model predicted was that although that many people would be working on the submarine, about 2,200 of them would actually be displaced from other jobs elsewhere in the economy. The nature of the models they used looks not just at the direct activities, but the way in which the activities impact on the economy overall. With a net employment forecast far below the government's figures, released publicly so far for the future submarine project, it's easy to see why this economic impact study was only released under freedom of information. Taken together, the two studies imply that every dollar of defence exports generates 32 times more jobs than a dollar spent building defence equipment in country. Even though both studies use the same sort of economic model, there's a significant difference between the two situations. While the submarine project requires additional taxation to fund the build, Joint Strike Fighter-related exports don't. Because the models used take account of taxation, that may help explain the dramatic difference in the results. Indeed, all other things being equal, you would expect additional taxation to suppress economic activity in the broader economy. Other factors that might be relevant are the geographical location of the activities and also the implementation and the assumptions that were fed into the two models. But taken at face value, if this result, a 32 times greater effectiveness in creating jobs in the form of exports, a renewed emphasis on defence export facilitation and global supply chain agreements would appear to be called for. In some circumstances, the maximum economic benefit might be gained by foregoing domestic production in favour of securing access for local firms into global supply chains. Remember, the F-35 exports only came about because we're purchasing aircraft from the United States. Of course, two isolated studies are a fragile basis to build a policy upon. Without further work, we can't be sure how much of the difference between the two studies comes from the export nature of the F-35 program, as opposed to other differences in what was modelled and how the modelling was conducted. Indeed, without independent replication, we can't be sure that either study is correct. If the government is serious about jobs and growth, it should commission economic modelling to properly and systematically determine how Australian defence spending can best be harnessed to create jobs in the economy. If we're going to use defence spending to grow the economy, let's do it properly. Let's get the most we can out of it. Another factor critical to the delivery of a strengthened ADF is the development and approval of acquisition projects. Because there have been significant reforms to capability development under the auspices of the First Principles Review, that's the context I'd like to use to explain what's been happening. The good news, in the broad, is that reform is going well across the vast defence enterprise. 2 years on from the First Principles Review, and 63 of 69 recommendations have now been completed, and the vast bulk of remaining recommendations are expected to be signed off by mid-year. Indications are that the implementation of the First Principles Review has been a case study in careful and systematic change management. Structural changes are now complete. New committees are well established and have been operating for more than 12 months. and the new processes that the First Principles Review brought in are being refined. Nowhere have the changes been more transformative than in the capability life cycle, particularly the capability development process. A key metric for the new arrangements is the approval of new projects in line with the demands of the 2016 Integrated Investment Plan. However, after years of uninterrupted transparency, the government has ceased disclosing what projects it has approved. While that might be taken as a sign that things are not going well, I actually don't think that's the case. As best can be estimated from public sources, although approvals look to be running somewhat behind schedule, it's not by much. If anything, the recent pace of project approvals has matched or exceeded historical rates. I had anticipated that the disruption wrought by the new arrangement would result in severe delays. I was wrong, and I'm happy to be wrong. What I failed to appreciate, but now understand, is that the reforms to capability development were really just a dismantling of the CNAID reforms that were brought in 2004. Acquisition and sustainment activities are now back within Defence rather than in an external agency. Internal contestability has been re-established. Finance has gotten its old seat back on Defence's Capability Committee, and the detailed paperwork introduced under the CNAID reforms has been pared back substantially. Everything old is new again. For all the talk of smart buyer, the tools of the trade have not changed. Acquisition strategies have always been tailored to the problem at hand, and sole source acquisitions have been commonplace for as long as Defence has been buying equipment. What's happened is that we've reverted to the old balance between expediency and risk, with the emphasis on the former. The CNAID processes came after a series of very embarrassing projects which vexed the government of the day. And the CNAID reforms sacrificed time to retire risk, whereas the new approach shifts the balance back to where it was. So while some unnecessary work has probably been eliminated by the recent changes, so too have many of the checks and balances introduced by the CNAID reforms. Consider for a moment the air warfare destroyer. The design phase began with the bespoke Baby Ali Burke solution as the preferred design. Everybody thought that the Navantia F-100 was a stalking horse that had only been included in the project because the CNAID reforms mandated an off-the-shelf solution. But once the hard work had been done, it became clear that a properly informed analysis of cost, risk and capability actually favoured the Spanish design, and it's the Spanish design we went with. Given the troubles experienced with the less ambitious F-100 design, imagine where we would be now if we'd truncated the process early and sole sourced the US design. The lesson is simple. You don't know what you don't know. There is no magic formula that allows essentially the same group of people to somehow make better decisions in less time and with less information. Just because you call yourself a smart buyer does not make it so. I don't make these observations as criticisms. Our current strategic situation justifies an elevated tolerance of procurement risk. But if that's what we're going to do, we need to recognise what we're doing and adjust accordingly. Most importantly, we need to marshal sufficient resources to manage the risks that we're creating. Given the massive scale and manifest risk of the planned program, we could devote substantial additional resources to its management and be confident of a positive return on investment. The danger is that recent reforms to Defence have stripped away program management capacity just when the opposite should be happening. Now I want to go on and address the question I alluded to at the start. And the question is, how much is enough? Even if everything goes to plan, That is, the government continues to meet its promises, defence and industry continue to deliver capability on time and within budget, there's a crucial question that remains. Are we doing enough to address the risks that Australia faces at this point in time? It's worth remembering that the scale and timing of today's plans for the ADF are the consequences of an ad hoc decision to spend 2% of GDP by an arbitrary date. To pretend otherwise is to mistake numerology for strategy. What's more, the capabilities sought in the 2016 White Paper are really the same capabilities that were sought 7 years earlier in the Rudd government's abandoned 2009 plan. Not only did today's plans have their genesis in far less challenging times, but we are starting 7 years late. In case you've missed it, the world is going to hell. Or, as Henry Kissinger put it, he's much more eloquent than I am, he said only last year, the world is in chaos. In January this year, a report from the normally staid US National Intelligence Council, that's the official body that coordinates all US national intelligence activities, pointed to what it described, I quote, deep shifts in the global landscape that portend a dark and difficult near future. Then went on to say, I'll read an entire paragraph. The next 5 years will see rising tensions within and between countries. Global growth will slow, just as increasingly complex global challenges impend. An ever-widening range of states, organisations and empowered individuals will shape geopolitics. For better and worse, the emerging global landscape is drawing to a close an era of American dominance following the Cold War. So too, perhaps, is the rules-based international order that emerged after World War II. If the US intelligence system is saying this in public, what must they be advising their government in private? Yet, here in Australia, we continue on as if it's business as usual, squabbling about whether defence industry jobs will be created in this electorate or that electorate. The risk is that we've taken our eyes off the ball at what might be a critical juncture in history. Current plans will only strengthen Australia's defences slowly. For example, our aptly named future submarines won't enter service until the early 2030s, and that's the first boat. The last of the 12 boats will not enter service until mid-century. The glacial pace of strengthening the ADF is consistent with the 2016 Defence White Paper's assessment that, and I quote, the United States will remain the preeminent global military power over the next 2 decades, end quote. That's a critical judgment that the latest US National Intelligence Council assessment calls into serious question. I think that that's actually giving the White Paper more credit than it deserves. We know that neither the scale nor pace of plans for the ADF has anything to do with balancing strategic risks and costs, let alone soothsaying about where the US will be in 20 years. As I explained before, today's plans are driven by the decision to spend an arbitrary share of GDP by an arbitrary date. My view is that we need to do more, and we need to start doing it now. The quickest and most cost-effective way to strengthen our defences would be to enhance the readiness and sustainability of existing capabilities. Stockpiles of munitions and spare parts should be made sufficient for prolonged independent operations, and additional personnel should be signed up to increase the availability of existing platforms for deployment. We should analyse where and how we can get the most worthwhile boosts to capability for every dollar we spend, starting with the capabilities we have now. Next, we should examine the feasibility of keeping selected platforms in service beyond their planned retirement dates, even if only as reserve capabilities. Our 71 classic Hornet fighters would be a perfect candidate, but I think we've probably missed the point of no return with those particular assets. What about new capability? Naval platforms might seem an obvious solution, but they take too long to build, at least the way we do it. In the beginning of World War II, Australia planned to build 8 2,500-tonne tribal-class destroyers. Only 3 were delivered before the war's end. Although the Army can expand quickly, I think we have adequate forces for the moment in that area. So it's to the Air Force we must turn. Aircraft are supremely useful in our part of the world, and mature designs are available from existing production lines. We should investigate expanded purchases of current and planned ADF combat aircraft. No decision yet be made at this point in time. We just need to do the staff work to develop the options. Think of it as an insurance policy, a contingency plan, with any final decision contingent on a further deterioration in our strategic outlook. Of course, Australia's security depends on a lot more than its military capabilities. Here are 3 areas that I would identify for priority action. First, we need to revitalise our diplomatic capacity. After years of cuts and growing demands for consular services, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is stretched to the limit. Australia's diplomats are the government's eyes, ears and voice in foreign capitals. Now more than ever, the government needs the unique insights and influence that only well-staffed and properly resourced embassies can deliver. Second, Australia's resilience to geopolitical disruption should be bolstered. Sophistry around Australia's non-compliance with the requirement to hold 90 days of fuel has gone on too long. If it's good enough for China, Japan, South Korea, the European Union and the United States to hold strategic fuel reserves, what makes Australia, an island far in the southern hemisphere, think that it can rely on foreign markets in a crisis to provide it with the fuel and energy it needs? A strategic reserve of oil and other critical commodities should be created without delay. Third, the government needs to practice its decision-making and crisis management skills. The National Security Committee of Cabinet should commence a program of structured simulations, war games in another name, to hone the government's response in a strategic crisis. No ADF unit would ever deploy without having completed an extensive exercise program to confirm its readiness. No lesser expectation should prevail for the government's higher decision-making processes. Alongside a strengthened defence force, those 3 measures would better position Australia to deal with the challenges of an increasingly unstable and uncertain world. The proposal set out here might seem overwrought. I'm sure there are many strategic Goldilockses who would argue that today's plans and defence posture are just right, despite the clear deterioration in the strategic landscape. But we currently plan to spend $450 billion, almost $500 billion on defence over the next decade. If that's the scale of spending needed to keep Australia safe in the 21st century, surely we can bring some of that money forward in a response to a deterioration, an obvious deterioration in our strategic environment. And there's one more thing we need. We need a strategy. For what it's worth, I'd double down on the US alliance. Nothing would please me more than to see a squadron of US Virginia-class nuclear submarines operating from an Australian port, except perhaps having those boats dual-crewed with RAN sailors. However, I know that a great many people would disagree with me. Barely a day goes by without a call for Australia to take a more independent position, which is code for moving away from the United States. These are issues we need to work through as a nation. We should be talking now about the choices that a future or even current government might have to make. It's possible and even likely that in what the National Intelligence Council calls the dark and difficult near future, an Australian government will have to make rapid decisions with profound consequences for generations to come. Thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you. That was excellent, if not a little scary. But I think right on the money in terms of your prescriptions and your concerns. Now, we've got time for 10 minutes or so of questions. Are we going to use mics or we're good? So can I ask you to please put up your hand and then wait for a mic to come your way? And you're going to have to wave a little bit because the lights are fairly bright. We'll go to Nick Stewart first and then we'll go to Brad. And these are going to be concise and crisp questions, gentlemen.
I will attempt to. However, I would like to say I've been coming to these for a number of years and I've always loved them, and Mark Thomson has always pointed out the severe deficiencies in government expenditure. I'd like you to bring back the real Mark Thomson. Because you seem to have said that the government's actually doing it. You highlighted 3 particular areas right at the end that you think are significant. I was wondering, including a 4th area, capability, which is the most significant area? I mean, I don't have a story to write after tonight's presentation. What is the area that you think is most vital for Australia in the future?
Well, the right way to address the problem is you allocate the resources that you have available in the order that gives you the most benefit. Okay? Off the top of my head, if I had a limited pile of money, the first thing I'd do is I'd be putting more money into Australia's diplomatic effort. That would be the first place I'd be making an effort. The ADF, improving the preparedness of the ADF would be an expensive proposition, and it would be a very difficult one politically for the government because it would probably mean pushing off that surplus in 2020-21 to some time in the future. But at some point you've got to ask yourself, what would you prefer, a AAA credit rating or having to go into a major conflict ill-prepared?
Mark, would you take 100 million out of the defence budget for that diplomatic effort?
I don't know how expensive diplomats are, but I would...
not very.
But I would certainly be willing to take money out of defence to bolster foreign affairs.
There's your story, Nick. No. Brad.
Mark, listening on? An observation, then a question. Just in case you thought we weren't paying attention, your visual aid showing service personnel, and I think this is the answer to the problem of recruitment to the ADF, 2 out of the 3 were members of the New Zealand Defence Force, not the Australian Defence Force.
Did you notice that, Chris?
My question is this, the question that I asked last year, in fact, and which you've half answered already, readiness and sustainability. This has been the Cinderella in defence funding for as long as I can remember, and that's going back many decades. I infer then that there is nothing in the current budget which indicates that the government is responding to indicators and warning on readiness and sustainability. Is that true?
Let me tell you what I think the situation is at the moment. We've had 15 years of relatively high operational tempo, especially in Army, more recently in Air Force, and continuously at a lesser level for the Navy. As a result of that demand, the Defence Force has been restructured and reconfigured in such a way that it can confidently maintain the sort of operational tempo that we've experienced now, and even higher operational tempos that we experienced 4 or 5 years ago. So I think this century has been a journey of the Defence Force filling out hollowness and improving its readiness and sustainability. So I'm not criticising what's been done so far. There's been great progress. We're a country mile or more ahead of where we used to be. What I'm suggesting, however, is that we have a bunch of assets, a bunch of fixed investments in aircraft, in ships, in army capabilities of one sort or another. And in probably most cases, and certainly in a large number of cases, we're not fully utilising those assets. We could not, if there was a conflict, use them to their absolute limit of availability and sustainability. To do that, we'd have to put more money into it. We have a defence force which is supremely well designed to do what it's been doing for the last 15 years, and that is deploy maybe 3,500 people to the Middle East and sustain them there in the sort of operations that we've been executing. The sort of risks I was talking about today and the sort of risks that the National Intelligence Council is alluding to are different types of risk of a different order of magnitude.
That's one or two more questions for Mark. Over here, Hugh.
Three questions, in fact, if you'll indulge me. The first is, what makes you think that the problem with our diplomacy is that they don't have enough money rather than they don't have a serious policy to implement? The second is, you mentioned as a very important point, the suggestion that the government should make contingency plans for significantly expanding the capability of the ADF, but hold off on actually spending money until the evidence that it's required becomes clearer. What are you waiting for? What has not happened yet which will convince you that it is now time to spend that extra money? And thirdly, what makes you confident that the United States is going to play the role in Asia that would make it sensible for Australia to focus on enhanced defence cooperation with the United States as a principal way of dealing with the significantly increased strategic challenges that we face?
I'll start with the first question, and you'll have to remind me of the others as I go along. You will note the last thing I said is we need a strategy. So I'm not disagreeing with you on that point at all. But in any case, having diplomats, properly resourced diplomats out there collecting information, grabbing people by the lapel and telling them about Australia's interests, forging relationships with decision makers and influencers in foreign capitals, even if you don't have a strategy, that's a necessary thing to allow you to bumble on through. But I think we need both, okay? The second question was, what haven't we seen yet? Okay.
When would you start expanding?
Okay. Well, let's talk about today. What happened today? Okay. Moody's downgraded the debt in China, which has increased the long-standing misgivings that a lot of economists have about the sustainability of Chinese growth. And if you think China growing at 7% per annum is scary, I think it can be a lot scarier if it's growing at 2% or contracting. Okay. Second thing that happened today is President Trump, the leader of the free world, disclosed to President Duterte of the Philippines the location of 2 nuclear submarines off Korea. Okay. And what was the third thing that happened? Sorry? Oh, and the US did its first FONOP in the South China Sea under President Trump, and that's just today. The answer is, well, I can only write so fast, okay? Yeah. Sorry?
So what are you waiting for?
What am I? Look, I didn't think I'd stand up here and be accused of being not forward-looking enough on this, but
your point is right. We don't need the strategic equivalent of the Lent Cafe siege. That's right.
Yeah.
But that's what we're in right now.
Look, the point is, you can start doing the work now, and you've lost nothing. You make the decision. And the third question was the United States. And look, I'll fudge that and say that's a talk for another day. But let me make this point very quickly. Think back to World War II. If you think back to World War II, the US identified Australia as a necessary geopolitical building block of their ability to do what they wanted to do. So Australia has some pretty good real estate, and even if they get pushed out of North Asia, there's a good argument for them wanting to stick here. Now, I don't know.
Very important question.
Well, it is, and you will note I said we need to have a debate about this, but I don't think it's entirely an analytic debate about what the optimum course of action here is. I think it's a question about where Australia wants to situate itself at what might be the twilight of the neoliberal order. So I think, yeah.
Let's take one last question. Hi, Commissioner.
Yeah, hi, Mark. Thank you very much. So I'm Paul Madison. I'm Canada's High Commissioner, former Chief of Navy, and so a quick comment about the defence versus being a diplomat. I can tell you from the Canadian lens that having been in Canberra for a couple of years and run a medium-sized mission, that I feel that defence in Ottawa is very, very well funded. And I've been telling my new colleagues in Ottawa that they really need to be going downtown over the other side of town to defence and figuring out how successful those folks have been. So, no, but I do have a question for you, and my question is around human capital. The human capital necessary to actually execute the program. One of the challenges we've had in Ottawa over many, many years is just having the right folks with the right skills, the right project management expertise, the right trust and relationships with industry, and the ability to actually work the town in that interdepartmental whole of government, political staffs, treasury approvals, funding gates, etc. That whole business of actually getting the money spent. It has become a challenge over the years, and tens of billions, tens of billions of dollars have slipped. So my question for you in this very this outstanding vision of recapitalization of the ADF going forward for all the right strategic reasons, is it your assessment that the human capital is in place to actually prosecute the program in a timely manner?
I'm concerned that it isn't, because we've just gone through a reform program in defence, which I think could accurately be described as leaning. We've got a lean operation in place. I don't think that's compatible with increasing defence investment by something like 7.8% for the remainder of this decade. Now, some of that slack can be taken up by industry. If you're willing to trust industry more, industry can play a more positive role there. But that's really a solution for down track when things are up and running. When you're conceiving and you're making the decisions, and the decisions you make up front are the ones you've got to live with for the next 30 years. And that's where the big costs and the big errors get made, is up front. So I would have been pleased as punch this year to see the government announce that they were going to put another 1,000 people into CASG, our Capability and Acquisition Sustainment Group, and make a commensurate increase in the number of people who are now in the services conceiving these projects. That's it's a false economy to economise on the initiation of multi-billion-dollar programs.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Mark Thomson.